topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Oh, we got a great show planned for you and a great guest. Todd Sheets is going to be joining us in just a moment. Great book that he wrote that came out last year, 2008. What really happened, huh? Think about that. And it's a big question still, understanding the great financial crisis. And, typical of anything that happens in the government, they always want to try to whitewash it, right? And put their spin on it to kind of confuse us and not really give the whole skinny of what happened. I know that kind of surprises you, right? Like we haven't had a lot of experience in the recent decades of, this fake news and what the government, here they are, they want a department of misinformation. That's just basically what it amounts to is, trying to do brain surgery on themselves. They just, they can't help themselves. Everybody is so fixed and ideologically predetermined that they've lost track of what the truth really is and what truth, how the truth serves us. And that's what it comes down to. But when people deceive us, they're not interested in serving us. They're interested in covering their back ends and their own interests, not we the people, not America. And this has been the problem with our politics for quite a while. And of course, now the dynamic that you have with journalism jumping ship and abandoning their reason to exist and violating the journalistic ethos of pursuing the truth no matter where it leads and giving us an objective viewpoint. I mean, this is going to be really tough. I think, generations ahead will look back in this era and go, boy, I just can't make sense of this. It is such a mess. And even if we go and utilize the data that has been reported here, it's nonsense. It just doesn't seem valid. And their instincts are going to be correct if they have a familiarity with the truth. But if they don't, then, they're going to be that much further off the mark because, unfortunately, the mainstream media has abandoned ship, as I said. They've forgotten about objective reporting. And there's lots of pressures. I was speaking with another guest this morning about this issue. There's lots of pressures on the media, especially on the Beltway, because everybody wants to be a part of the reindeer games, right? And if you are on the side of where power exists, so right now the Republicans are in power. So if you're pro-conservative, the doors seem to open a little bit easier for you. And if you're liberal, you're going to run into problems, which is obvious. We saw what happened with AP, CNN, and other liberal entities that have been purveyors of fake news when it comes to conservatism. Look, I don't mind people reporting, but let it be known it's an opinion and don't present something as a fact. And that's all the way around. See, everybody's gotten really fast and loose with the facts. You have a right, to your opinion, but not the facts, because the facts should not change. They should be consistent. I think we can agree on that, right? And you hear from politicians and, the way they present things, Hakeem Jeffries and others, as if things are the fact. In fact, we had a president not that long ago who insisted that science, there were certain aspects of science, like global warming. He says, well, that's a fact. Well, that's not even a scientific term. It could be a law, but not a fact. And but see, these are how these terms are so loosely used. And he even said at one point, words have meaning. Well, yeah, okay, that's true. And that was the thing that was so dangerous about him in particular, was that he could be truthful at times, but it can also be very deceptive. You just had to see which side of his mouth he was speaking from. And that was the thing that was so frustrating, because I have no tolerance for people. I want you to be consistent. I have more respect for you if you're just a liar all the time, as opposed to somebody who is trying to, be deceptive and, tell you one thing and do something else. And I get the pressures. I really do, even though I haven't been on the Beltway, but I can empathize with what some of these, some of these reporters have to deal with. They claim that they're pursuing the truth, and here it is. They lied to us, for example, about Joe Biden for 4 years. Now all of a sudden they want to be honest and say, yeah, we knew that he was slipping up. Yeah, you were the same ones that were echoing the advisement and the description of Joe Biden being sharper than a tack, and he had it all together, when anybody with even bad eyesight and poor hearing could see that Joe Biden was losing it. And now they want to act like as if they were there, even about COVID, for example. Oh, yeah, wait a minute. You didn't even spend a day in YouTube jail. We spent days in YouTube jail, and we were castigated. And for what? And we kept saying, look, this is dangerous. This is dangerous for the American people. When you're talking about health, you're talking about anything that has to do, like I said, with these major issues. We need to know the truth. We need to understand what's going on. If we're going to go to war, why are we going to war? What are the facts? I mean, you're going to be spending my taxpayer money, then I think I have a right to ask some questions and get some answers as to why this is justified. And here it is. I mean, the pattern of America, which Dwight Eisenhower warned us about, the military-industrial complex, because they are a beast. The industrial complex is a beast that needs to be fed, and it's insatiable, and it loves a war. Hasn't seen a war it hasn't fallen in love with. And next thing you know, we're getting drawn into these endless wars with no end in sight. And then down the road, you get the question: why are we fighting this? You forget even why you're at war. All you know is that you're at war, killing people and destroying things and wasting a lot of money. And after everything is all said and done, you leave $80 billion worth of military equipment behind. People are dying in your wake as you exit once again, as you cut and run. It's not a good look for America. But, hey, this is what we're dealing with, sadly. And it's so unfortunate and frustrating that we're ending up in that kind of situation. So, it really, I put pressure on the media, that the media has to find its heart and soul again, and they cannot side with power, because once you've crossed that line, you're not really a reporting agency any longer. What you've become is a propaganda arm for a political party. And this is valid for both sides, whether you're rooting, for Republicans or Democrats. We need the media. I mean, there was a reason why our founding fathers cherished our First Amendment right, why it was so critical. But embedded in that First Amendment right was the general consensus that we would be honest, that we'd be truthful. And once truth is compromised, for whatever reason, somebody buys you off, they pay you money, or they hold up a carrot and say, hey, look, you get to hang out with the big boys here, and you get to go to all the reindeer games and the cocktail parties and everything like that. And all you got to do is do our bidding. Once you start doing that, then, what good are you to the American people? You've given them a false narrative, and you end up putting us at each other's throats, sadly. And that is beyond frustrating. That this is what what they've done to us. And whether it's the media or even these social media platforms, as I've mentioned to you before, I mean, here Mark Zuckerberg, and before it was Twitter, and these other social media platforms, what did they do? I mean, they buckled under, and it's just unbelievable, and I don't know. I mean, it's like I said, it's frustrating that they and I say the media, but anybody that pretends that they're objective and that they're giving us the whole truth and nothing but then along the way, for the sake of power and control and influence, they sell themselves out. And at what cost? Here we are. I mean, it's amazing to me. You see this polling that comes out, and you've got 40% of America against 60% of America. I mean, that's pretty crazy numbers when you think about it. And you go, okay, what's going on here? I mean, is the 40% in the tank? Are they just so much supportive of these things that really are anti-American? And I say that only from a standpoint that, who doesn't want our government to be efficient? What's wrong with that? I mean, is it okay to spend even your great grandchildren's money to people that they're not even alive yet? They haven't been born. And I guess that's okay. We shouldn't be outraged about it. I mean, this is just incredibly, frustrating. But you got 40% of the people that are angry and upset because of, you can say Trump derangement syndrome if you want, and of course that's carried over into Elon Musk. And here's Elon Musk. Yes, he's been very wealthy, but it wasn't because somebody gave it to him. He's worked his tail off. And Donald Trump leveraged what he had, which is nothing different than the Kennedys. If you remember, I don't know if you knew this about the Kennedys, but the Kennedys were rewarded. I mean, upon their birth, I think Joe, the father, would put like $1 million into their account, and they would use that kind of as seed money for their careers and education and that sort of thing. So what Donald Trump has done is nothing different than any other family has done, and of wealth that they could invest in their children, and hopefully their children spend that investment wisely. And Donald Trump has leveraged it wisely. I mean, has he been perfect? Nobody's been perfect. I mean, nobody's perfect. We make mistakes, but anyway, look at Todd Sheets has joined us right now, and I want to bring him on to talk about his book, 2008, What Really Happened, and also talking about free and fair trade. Todd Sheets, welcome to the show. Good to have you with us.
Bill, thanks. I'm delighted to be with you today.
Well, I'm sorry for a little bit of the technical difficulties we had, but that's okay. We're going to make the most of this time that we have. First of all, before we get into tariffs, I want to talk about your book, 2008, What Really Happened. Give you a chance to tell this new audience that we haven't, heretofore had a chance to interact with, and give them background of your book and why you wrote the book.
Yeah, so I got into writing the book a long time ago, actually, when the crisis came along. As I told one of my children at the time, it felt to me like a lot of the assumptions I had operated under during all of my business career were kind of being thrown out the window, and we were totally changing the relationship between government and the economy in ways that I didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, I need to do a deep dive into this. So I spent several years researching that, going back throughout history, and then another couple of years specifically focused on the financial crisis. And then that's what led to the writing of the book here. Yes. So,
well, and the thing is that we're still paying for it, aren't we, Todd?
Well, very much so. I mean, one of the key things is we didn't learn the right lessons from what happened. And if you don't learn the right lessons, you can't change things and create the right policies to keep it from happening again, or in a slightly different way, maybe. And so, the lesson that was generally taken away was that this happened because of a gradual trend of deregulation that went too far and allowed the system to run crazy and run amok. And some of those things about the system going crazy did happen. But what we have to ask ourselves is, why did that happen specifically at that point in time? And does that theory, is it consistent with the facts of what really happened in the housing bubble? And if you go back and study the bubble itself, as I've done and as I lay out in the book, what we find is that bubble began in 1998, when housing prices suddenly went off trend. All of a sudden, we saw a huge escalation in housing prices that was unlike anything else that we had seen before. And it stayed that way for 4 consecutive years. So that's not like a gradual change. This is a sudden change from the history. And then in 2001, we see
well, Todd, let me ask you, when it made that radical change, why did it do that?
Yeah, so that's the other thing in the book is I went back, and what we found was that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two government-sponsored enterprises, special privileges designed to enhance mortgage access for low to moderate income people, were basically created in their modern form in the late 60s and early 70s. At that time, they were very small, but because of the political privileges that were extended to them, it gave them a competitive advantage versus everybody else. And over the course of decades, their market share grew and grew until by the mid-90s, they were well above 40% of the housing market finance that they effectively controlled.
Yeah.
And so that was a change we had never seen. And then beginning in 1998, the exact year that the housing prices took off, Fannie and Freddie doubled their growth rates. They had been growing by about 7% a year, and all of a sudden they started growing by about 15% a year. And I go through a bunch of different analyses that basically show conclusively that this was the trigger for the beginning part, the first 4 years of the housing bubble.
Now, the demographics that Freddie and Fannie were addressing were minorities by and large, right?
To a very large extent, yes.
Okay. So that became a sensitive issue. And maybe that caused people to be a little bit blind to what was going on, because you, as a finance expert, you would say, whoa, we need to hit the brakes here. And you didn't need to wait for it to have those kind of dramatic increases. You started to see, as you're looking at the data, you're saying, whoa, something's, we need to be concerned about it. But, typical of things that get politically mired, people can be blind to it. And before you know it, then you've got a serious problem. And then worse yet, you look to the government to give us to solve the problem that they created.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you're exactly right about this. I mean, this ended up hurting the people that it was supposed to help,
exactly.
Which is what unfortunately happens over and over again. So, and we see it, you can follow the housing policy, which was coming out of Washington. Fannie Mae, who helped initiate this, was run by a minority.
Yes.
The George Bush administration, they talked about increasing home ownership among Hispanics and others and those types of things.
Well, and you had Bill Clinton before that. It was the big push of everybody needed a part of the American dream. But it was like, okay, I think we should all have a shot at it. But if you're not qualified, then at what cost?
Yeah. And the problem is when you start pushing this, and then you create these high rates of appreciation in housing, which were then made even worse in the early 2000s by Federal Reserve policies. What starts to happen is, people think, well, they stop thinking about this like, oh, this is a long-term source of wealth. Right. If I buy it and I hold for 10, 15, 20 years, it'll grow slowly over time. And all of a sudden, it almost starts to become like a casino game where you've got to get in on the action. And that's exactly what happened as a result of Fannie and Freddie first, and then the Federal Reserve making the critical mistake when they pushed interest rates down so low in the early 2000s. It added fuel to the fire that had already been started. And then that's what pulled so many of these unsuspecting people who were supposed to be helped by all of this in at the worst possible time. And the numbers on foreclosures were like something like 4 million homes foreclosed during that period of time, when it all fell apart and collapsed.
Exactly. And you think about these people that suddenly they're homeless.
Yes, actually, I've spoken to people who went through that. They had a business going, they had things going on. They bought a home maybe that they couldn't really afford, and then this collapse happens. There's a downturn in the economy. They become homeless. There's thousands and thousands of people working in construction. Again, low to moderate income working class people in construction, in housing, in, the mortgage industry who are laid off as a result of all of this. There's people whose 401ks are invested in these major financial institutions, a number of which go completely broke during this. And so, a portion of that savings is wiped out by the losses that are experienced by these
Exactly.
companies. It's a huge disaster.
Well, and then you had the adjustable rate mortgages that contributed to this as well, because it gave people a false sense of security that they could afford a lot more home than they actually could, because maybe you were okay for 5 to 7 years, but then all of a sudden the adjustable rate kicked in, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly, it's a perfect point, because that's what the Fed did. At that time, the Fed's control of interest rates was focused on short-term interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
And when the tech stock bubble collapsed, which the Fed had played a role in blowing and creating that also, the Fed reacted in 2000 by pushing short-term rates down low. And when short-term rates were pushed down below the rate of home appreciation, that was a historically unique thing that gave people what looked like a great opportunity to leverage up the returns on a home. So a home might be growing 4 or 5 or 6% a year,
Right.
but if you've got a lot of debt and it's on a variable rate mortgage with an interest rate below the rate of home appreciation, then that's what, creates these 15, 20, 25% a year increases in your equity investment. And that's where the Fed blew it. They didn't understand that they were creating this very unique incentive to buy homes leveraged up with short-term financing. And again, I go through all these statistics in the book. What you see is in the second phase, this what I call the acceleration phase of the bubble from around 2001 to 2005 or 6 was driven by a massive increase in short-term variable rate lending that pulled all these people in and pushed the bubble up even to more dangerous levels.
And the thing is, Todd, I'm reminded that this was almost, our, the modern era version of a market crash. People committed suicide. They lost their homes, everything, their hope, their dreams, that they thought, oh, here I am. I get the part of the American dream, and now it's no more. This was devastating psychologically to everyday Americans.
Yeah, I've talked to people who went from, having a semi-successful business, a young child who were living out of their car. They were foreclosed out of their home. They lost the money in their business when the downturn came. They were living out of a home or out of their car for a while with a young child, with a baby.
Yeah. Imagine.
And, this was just a devastating set of circumstances. Yes.
You see, this is so irresponsible. And it's like, who do you pin this on? In your book, there's lots of, like anything, like any perfect storm, there's lots of contributing factors. But what I find so appalling is that it seemed the people that were injured the most, got the least comfort out of this. Like I said, you got suicide rates going up. People, like you say, one day they have a business, next day they're living out of their car. And this wasn't something that they had to endure for, maybe a couple of months. This went on for years for them to recover.
Yeah, the unemployment rate stayed very high for years after this. It wasn't until, the late 2010s before unemployment rates started really coming back down to more normal kinds of levels and that kind of thing. So this was, it was the great financial crisis followed by the Great Recession, neither of which were so great.
Right, exactly.
Only in magnitude of the damage.
Yeah, exactly.
Much. And this was the worst downturn that we had seen since the Great Depression in this country. And it was devastating. And, as we started off talking about, we did not learn these lessons, that this was really caused by misguided housing policy and misguided Federal Reserve policies.
Right. And you say the misguided reserve policies, was that post the burst, or that this was during the whole process? Because now you got a problem and everything's crashing and burning. And then we're looking for the people that created the problem to fix the problem. What's wrong with this picture?
That's exactly right. I just put out a post on this on Substack here recently about the history of the Federal Reserve in this never-ending stream of problems. And this was a situation where, the Fed, once the crisis happened, they did do some things to help from keeping it to spread even more out of control. But that misses the fact that they had played a major role. They were one of the two primary sources of the crisis in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so, I said there's an element there of like thanking the arsonist for helping put out the fire that they had created, which is really what the situation was.
Right. And here you use taxpayer money to save banks. Was that a smart move?
I was very frustrated by that at the time. It was part of this bailout culture that is a very unfortunate consequence. And that really was something that the Fed started back in the 90s, and it expanded and expanded and expanded to this disastrous point. I do think now, when we finally got to that point, they did need to step in and provide some financing to the system in order to keep it from spinning even further out of control. So that's what they did that was correct. But again, they were only resolving a problem that was largely of their own creation. And this was a big part of what was missed in the aftermath, because instead of understanding what the Fed had done and the mistakes it had made to create the problem, they got a lot of credit in Washington for playing this role, and then their role was expanded. I mean, they got larger regulatory oversight over the system that they had largely been responsible for driving into the tank. And then they came back with these very same policies. What I call it is it's an addiction to cheap money and low interest rates. These were the same policies that had played a big role in causing the tech stock bubble to blow up and collapse in 2000, and then causing the housing bubble to blow up and collapse. And they went into it again in the 2010s in an even bigger way. They doubled down on these failed policies.
Wow. And I want to go back to Freddie and Fannie for a moment. There were early signs, and some senators and Congress people were sounding the alarm on Freddie and Fannie. And it became a race thing, because you had, I believe, Franklin Raines. Was he ahead of?
Yeah.
Was he ahead of Freddie or Fannie? One of those.
He was ahead of Fannie. Yeah.
Right. And so then it became a race deal. Oh, you're only doing this because he's black, and you're attacking, the black community here. And so they kind of negated that. And then after everything is all said and done, Raines, who had made some major mistakes, he gets rewarded with a golden parachute. Almost a couple $100 million, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what the size of that was. And this is a very unfortunate thing, and it's a very important point, because, I remember listening to Franklin Raines on conference calls at that time, as I was an investor, not in Fannie Mae, but investing my own portfolio and that kind of thing. And this is a very, very capable, very intelligent guy with a long track record, who truly believed, I believe, genuinely, in the mission of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That he had talked about growing up in a very low income family. I think it was in Seattle. His dad had been put out of work at one point in time, had to go on food stamps. He took a job picking, I think it was beans in fields out of town. Franklin would go along with his dad. His dad was so resourceful, though, that he went and bought a foreclosed home that was going to be, that had been condemned so a new highway could be built, just for the lumber, tore it down, and then built a home in another area. And that became a big source of wealth for the Raines family. That was and so I think this just shows even very intelligent, well-meaning people, when they get involved in trying to create these massive programs that are designed to help other people, and their interests are sincere, they just end up almost inevitably blowing them up in such a way that they become so big that they cause more damage than they're intended to. So good intentions and well-meaning people don't lead to good outcomes. And that's one lesson we just keep failing to learn from all of these situations.
And Todd, the thing is, okay, look at we're human. We can make mistakes, but there should, I mean, in a sense, you did a postmortem on this whole situation here, and I don't see. I mean, there's a lot of wisdom and insight in what you've written here, but I don't see the manifestation of this going forward to where what happens when this happens again.
Well, in some ways, it has happened again. So
Yes.
we, because we didn't rein in the Fed's ability to blow these asset bubbles, we went through another 10 plus years of extraordinarily low short-term interest rates that they were trying to juice the economy up again.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is it's pushed asset prices up again. So now we have housing prices basically back at about or above the same levels that they were at the peak of the bubble. It doesn't mean we'll have another collapse because lending standards have changed.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some changes on the regulatory side, which are good. And the banks themselves are now very aware that this can happen.
Right.
People thought this couldn't happen in the 1990s and 2000s
because the properties were continuing to assess at such an incredible level, right?
Yeah, well, we had gone through 100 years without a national boom and bust. We had localized ones, like in Texas when the oil patch collapsed.
Right.
But nobody thought it could happen on a national basis. And again, what everybody missed was, for 30 years leading up to the 90s, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had been amassing so much of the national mortgage market that all of a sudden they were in a position to drive a change that had never happened before.
Mm-hmm.
So, but, we miss all these things. The Fed engages in this easy money, and we have very high housing prices. So we may not have a collapse, but we have a significant affordability crisis right now.
Right, exactly.
Young people trying to start a career or early in their career and starting a family, they don't have incomes to match today's housing prices.
Well, that's why you have so many people homeless living out of their cars, Todd, right now.
Exactly.
And in some states higher than, whether you're in New York or, California and others, it's just, it's not affordable.
Yeah. And so we fail to learn the lessons. We fail to hold the Fed accountable. They go through these policies again, and they create, there's an old saying that, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So it's not the exact same thing, but it's a related thing.
Exactly.
And the core is failing to rein in the Fed's ability to try and use easy money policies to stimulate the economy in ways that creates hidden and unforeseen issues like highly valued homes with an affordability problem or highly valued stocks that make them more vulnerable to, potential dislocations, or that may lower the returns going forward relative to what people have, expected based on where past stock returns and that kind of thing have been.
Well, we're talking with Todd Sheets. He's the author of the newsletter on wealth and progress. By the way, it's available to you for free. It's on Substack, and his book, 2008, What Really Happened. We've been breaking that down. It's quite the study. And the thing is, as people, that are in charge of this government, I still want to hold on to the constitutional principles that this is the government of, for, by, we the people. It is imperative that we be informed. It's the consent of the governed. And you cannot be a low information voter. You need to be aware of these things, because guess what? These things cycle. It's just like Todd said, it may not necessarily repeat, but it rhymes. And we get some sort of semblance of these types of activities that come in. And guess what happens? Traditionally, the politicians take the easy way out, and they write IOU checks on the backs of the American people. Right, Todd?
Bill, you couldn't have made a more perfect point. And one of the reasons, like I just mentioned, I just put out this piece on the Federal Reserve on Substack, which is called Fixing the Fed, Part 2, A Punch Bowl Full of Problems. And I go through this history of problems that have been created by the Federal Reserve. And I won't go through all the details now unless you want, but just tick them off. The Great Depression, the stagflation of the 1970s, the tech stock bubble and burst, the housing bubble and burst, and now these new issues that we've just talked about. And you have to sit back and ask, why does this keep happening?
Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't somebody rein the system in? And
Exactly.
the problem, and there's a very reasonable, rational explanation for that. The problem is, as the Fed has figured out that it can use its control of interest rates to try and manipulate the entire economy in a way that nobody else in the system has the ability to do, even bigger than Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Mm-hmm. As I say in one point in the book, by lowering interest rates in a credit-driven economy, they can drive everything from, the price of auto loans in Alaska to housing prices in Honolulu to stock prices on Wall Street. Exactly. They're the one thing out there that can drive all this. And the unfortunate element is that for a president who's elected and an administration, the temptation to have the Fed become involved in these preemptive moves to try and keep any and everything from causing a slight economic disruption, it's just too powerful for anybody to want to rein it in.
Right.
And so, I'm not accusing the existing administration of this, but almost any administration, you've got something that happens like some of the rolling financial crisis of the mid-90s, the Mexican peso crisis, or right. the Asian debt crisis, or the Russian debt crisis. They haven't caused an economic downturn yet. They aren't even causing failures that are cascading throughout the system. But there's this big incentive for the Federal Reserve to step in before any of that happens, push interest rates down, and try and keep it from spreading. Well, the problem is if you go back to that playbook too many times, you might keep things from happening in one administration, but you just kick the can down into the next administration.
Exactly.
And we get this game where this keeps happening and happening until it gets so big that the consequences are way beyond what the original problem really was.
Mm-hmm. Todd, you've been writing about, the tariffs and current trade situation that's going on in our country. For me, I'm optimistic about it, but I'm looking at it kind of like the way you have been, from a 30,000 foot perspective. And I think that if we had all hands on deck cooperating here, this challenge that we're doing right now in terms of, in a sense, we're reinventing our economy with what Donald Trump is offering here, which I think could be a good thing and could help us at least address some of that $37 trillion in debt that we have and get everybody else to kind of, this country has this sentiment that everybody should be paying their fair share. Well, what about our allies? What about the rest of the world that has been taking advantage of America and Americans? And I can't help but think that if the Fed was cooperative and on the same page of what we were trying to do, we could affect something that could be rather revolutionary and successful for everybody, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. But for some reason, because of TDS and this, deranged Donald Trump syndrome that people are going through, they're hurting. They're not hurting Donald Trump. They're hurting us. And I'm trying to, rally a cry here to say, we need to get on the same page. And I think this is a golden opportunity, and Trump's vision of a golden era for America could be possible, but it requires cooperation.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And I think, there's a lot of people. This is another thing where the criticism's coming from both the left, the anti-Trumpers,
yes,
and from the right, and another segment of the left, which basically keeps waving the free trade flag. But what you've got to, I think there's two big components here that we've got to take into consideration. One is China. And China, we cannot continue to fund the growth and the power of the Chinese Communist Party.
Amen.
If we had gone down this path with them and they had become a trading partner playing on an equal playing field by Western standards and rule of law, and they had become a global ally in terms of geopolitical issues, that would have been fantastic. Yeah. But it hasn't happened.
And it's not going to happen, do you think?
I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, I made a comment one place, once a totalitarian regime, always a totalitarian regime.
Right.
And the big mistake that we made there, and I understand why, but when you go back to the 90s, it was just after Tiananmen Square had fallen, for people who remember that or who they don't, that was a period when there were pro-democracy protests that took place, led largely by students. China was in the midst of moving down towards a more market-oriented economy to try and resurrect all the impoverished people that had been left over from communism. And the Communist Party let it go on for a little while, and then the tanks rolled in. A couple of thousand people were killed. They shut it down. And the message to the communist people to the Chinese people was very clear, but we missed it. The message was, we will only let these reforms go, economically or politically or from any other perspective, as long as they are in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
And unfortunately, we missed that. And as time has gone on, and we basically funded China's rise from an insignificant player in the world. Back in around 1990, their GDP was about 6% of ours, which means ours was 15 or 16 times bigger than theirs.
Exactly.
Today, they're almost 67% of ours, which means we're barely over 1 times the size of theirs. And they have become, they have not become a trading partner by Western standards. They basically engage in economic warfare. And on the geopolitical front, they are engaged all over the world in activities that are trying to counter, the initiative of America and democratic free countries. So that's the big issue in trading, and we have to deal with that. We cannot let the status quo go on so that their GDP keeps rising relative to ours, which makes them even a bigger adversary out there.
Right. Well, it's amazing how they've been able to declare war on America, and America, it just lets it happen. There's no response, whether, it had to do with trade, the import or export of fentanyl. We can talk about COVID, other things that the Chinese have done that have been antithetical to America's interest, and they continue to do that. And meanwhile, they're hovering over Taiwan. They're building, bases in the South China Sea, claiming that as their own land and property. I mean, it's almost like Ukraine and Russia deja vu one more time here.
Yeah, only from a much different perspective, which is that, because we isolated Russia's economy and it ended up collapsing because of the inefficiencies of the communist command and control model, they today are a relatively insignificant player from a economic resources perspective. They rank somewhere around 20th. I think their GDP is below Canada, Brazil, and a couple of other countries. So, they're rattling their sword and causing a lot of problems in Eastern Europe, but their ability to play a major geopolitical role is nothing like what it had been in the past, because they are so much smaller than we are and so many other countries. But now China is a major and real competitor. And added to all the issues you mentioned, China is also helping Russia and helping Iran.
Exactly. I was going to say,
cause havoc over in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe and that kind of thing. So, this is like, I think, we've got to go back to this model of isolating these hostile totalitarian regimes and holding and not allowing them into the, the global Western economy, which gives them the opportunity, to do all these things. And by the way, as they've done this, they've also continued exploiting their own working class people. It's not like all the benefits are flowing down to raising all these people up. I mean, what you hear about working standards over there are terrible in that kind of
thing. Exactly. Well, it's going to be a tough situation. It's like that Pennzoil commercial. You can pay me now or pay me later. The inference is when you defer it, it gets more expensive. And we've seen this in our own, as you cited earlier, we see this in our own government. The problem gets kicked down the road and it gets more complex, and the costs increase with the complexity. And so here we are. When are we going to face this problem? And Donald Trump has said, look, at no more. We're going to look for free and fair trade. We're going to look out for things that are in America's interest. Also looking at NATO and what's happening there in Europe, that the United States is, I think Donald Trump has seen it right to say, look, at the United States should not be carrying Ukraine to the level that we have been. The European countries, the neighbors there to Ukraine, have more to lose than the United States has to lose. But it seems that the United States cares more about Ukraine than they do.
Well, you touched on, I'm actually in the middle of writing another Substack piece, which I'll
you see, you're channeling me.
Yeah, I think so. I'm stealing all your good ideas. I'm going to address these exact issues. I mean, the times have changed. It was one thing at an earlier point in time for us to kind of play the global policeman role. But what people have lost sight of was, if you go back to the beginning of the U.S.-European relationship, and from a military perspective, World War I and World War II, we were not the first responder in either of those wars.
Exactly.
They started and major things happened and went on for years before we then came in to provide the backup support necessary to bring them to an end. But as time went on, it got to the point where, this almost absurd situation where you have a confrontation in Far Eastern Europe that, because Russia is now a much smaller player than it was during the years of the Soviet Union, it doesn't have big international global implications like World War I and World War II did. It is a regional, local kind of thing. Europe needs to take responsibility for that and play the first responder role. I think we can be playing a role, with tariffs and sanctions and those kinds of things to really squeeze down on Russia, which is where I'm hoping where this will all go. But Europe needs to be first and foremost responsible for this. But, they have shirked that responsibility in the post-World War II era. They were too happy to stay in a dependent state on the United States, instead of assuming the responsibility for their own safety and defense. And that's just a massive failure of leadership on the part of the leading European countries over there.
And they need to be aware that if this negotiation between Putin and Zelensky doesn't work out in a balanced sort of manner, in other words, that the bully is rewarded for being a bully, then what's their protection? So they need to be very interested in what's going on with the negotiations here and support a fair solution. Right now, it seems like Putin has all the cards, as Donald Trump would say, and he's just bullying his way through this, holding off, from not bombing Ukraine any further and having a committed 100% peace treaty until this is resolved, right?
Yeah, and I think I think that Russian economy is in a much more fragile state than they are letting on. I think they have spent enormous sums of money. The economy, a huge portion, I've heard numbers as much as 40% of their GDP is now made up of military spending. They are very oil dependent. They have inflation is up in the 20-25% range. They've been printing enormous amounts of money to try and keep funding this. And I think the numbers I've heard is they've lost close to or over 1 million people.
That's what I heard. And I don't know how this is sustainable for Putin as the leader. I think he's very vulnerable.
I agree. And I think if we really put the screws on him, he could pay a big price, which would send a message to anybody around the world that this is not the way to work your way out of your problems and that kind of
thing. Am I often thinking these EU countries, these neighboring countries should be more involved and have a higher interest in this?
I think they should be playing the leading role.
Yes.
We should be there we can be there in this soft approach, which is to screw down on the tariffs and the sanctions and the things that hurt the Russian economy. We should have a backup role from a monetary perspective, if at all, but they need to be playing the leading role in providing the financial support. And if boots are on the ground, that needs to come from Europe.
Todd, we got a minute left. I'm going to let you summarize this. I want to go back to tariffs and this opportunity that is before us. What do you see happening?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, we need to deal with the Chinese problem that we mentioned. That's going to be difficult, but I think it will be dealt with in a way where it's phased in so it gives business some time to adjust. That's a tough issue.
Right.
Second, we do need to level the playing field with our friends and allies. That's primarily Europe, Japan, and India, so that it's balanced. And when we get into the next round of growth, our workers here have the opportunity to participate in that on a fair and equal way. So we want to encourage people to trade with us, but we've got to move away from this post-World War thing where it was too one-sided in everybody else's favor and against our workers here.
How much time does Trump have, do you think, to carry this out? He's been saying this is in process. I believe that's the case, but I think that the clock is ticking, and it's a good opportunity for him because he scores a couple of wins here. He's going to close a lot of mouths really quick here and a lot of naysayers, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. And I think it'll happen sooner rather than later. I think there's big incentives for these other parties to negotiate, and there are big incentives for us to make it work for our companies also. So,
well, Todd, we got to leave it there. Todd Sheets, thank you so much for being with us. He's the author of the newsletter on wealth and progress. And right now it's available free of charge on Substack. He's also author of the book 2008, What Really Happened. Todd Sheets, thank you for being with us. Take care.
Bill, thanks so much. I enjoyed it.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for sharing a part of your day with us. So appreciate you joining in and, getting this information, and hopefully it blesses you and causes you to do your own studying and your own research so that you own your own knowledge, that you're not being told what you should believe. This is why this is what the show is all about, to bring you these guests that have the background, the experience, the knowledge to share with you, so that you know more, and hopefully you know more than what you did when you first started watching the show. Again, I thank you for being with us. May God bless you and may he keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you and give you peace. God bless. Thank you.